Well, good evening, everybody. A faithful remnant of our gathering this evening on the vigil of the Assumption, and had to make some special arrangements because of the weather, but God is in control, right? And we are not. So here we are, a good little group. Father Walsh and Father Coulter and Father Eckridge, our brothers, knights, and beautiful lay faithful, to celebrate the vigil of the Assumption. The beginning of this great solemnity in honor of Our Lady. One of her principal feasts of the year, a holy day of obligation, and linked very closely to the Immaculate Conception because, it's because of her Immaculate Conception that she did not suffer the effects of original sin. And of course, one of the effects of original sin is bodily death, which we all will go through that, but she did not. And I remember when I was becoming a Catholic and I was in college, and I was trying to wrap my head around all these Marian doctrines and all the stuff that Catholics believe, which I didn't grow up with this at all. Mary was there, but she was this, Mother of Jesus. Okay, fine. She kind of disappears, and no big deal. But then I realized, no, it is a big deal. I mean, she's the mother of Jesus, and that means that's something very special. Not only because of her son, but also because she's a mother, and mothers are very important. And I loved my mother, and so all of these things just made sense to me. I didn't put up obstacles like so many Protestants, who are looking at the Catholic Church, and they start to say, why do you Catholics spend so much time on Mary? Doesn't that take away from Jesus? I mean, he's our Savior, and so, this is kind of a typical thing, but I didn't have any of that because as it was explained to me, because I was basically dumb and I didn't really have anything, I wasn't that fervent of a Christian, so I didn't come into the Catholic Church with a lot of religious formation, so I wasn't already deeply into my Protestant faith, which is probably why when I was presented with these things like the Marian teaching, the Eucharist, confession to a priest, all these things are sort of the Pope. These are sort of hot button issues for Protestants when they're thinking and looking at the Catholic Church. I didn't have any of that, and once it was explained to me, it made a lot of sense. It just kind of fit. And with regard to Mary and this feast, that made perfect sense. That if we believe that original sin, one of the effects of original sin is death, that's when death and suffering came into the world. And then there's one person who did come into the world without original sin, and that was Mary, because she was being prepared to be the mother of Jesus. And so it all made sense to me. Another thing that was kind of interesting and helped me understand it and believe it a little more was the fact that, relics are really important to us as Catholics. And we have relics of everybody, right? We have the piece of the head of John the Baptist, we have, all these, all going on back to the apostles. And the tradition there is, of course, that when these holy people died, they were revered, and so they kept their bodies, they buried their bodies. And during the persecution, they had to protect them because the Romans would come in and try to destroy. And so they had to hide them, during the persecutions. But they kept them. And then, they built churches over the tombs of these great saints. And then there was the whole tradition of relics and the understanding that a relic is somehow linked to the person who used to embody this bone, And so there's some sort of a link to this great saint. And so we have this long, glorious history of relics. And it emphasizes the body, because the body is important, The body, even the deceased body of someone, is important. And the way we take care and prepare, that's why I'm a little bit uneasy with, I know the church allows it, a little bit uneasy with cremation. It's permittable. You can do that. But it just seems to me that the traditional way of laying a body to rest in the ground, like we've always done it, to me, it just makes more sense. Again, I'm not want to put, if you've decided to have yourself cremated, fine, that's perfectly permitted. But there's something about that, something about the body naturally decomposing. Well, so why am I talking about this? Because one thing was proposed to me when I was looking at the Catholic Church was, well, another argument for the assumption of Mary, body and the soul, is where are her bones? Where are her relics? You would think that of all the saints, they've got the head of John the Baptist, they've got the apostles. Well, surely they're going to have Mary's body somewhere, And they said, no, there's never been. Why? Because she was assumed, body and soul, into heaven. She was taken up into heaven at the end of her life. In fact, we can almost say that she didn't die. He called that the dormition of Mary. Some in the Eastern Church, they say that they believe that she just fell asleep at the end of her life and she was taken up. Because death, right, is an effect of original sin. And so, some claim that she really didn't die. I mean, she was just assumed up alive, body and soul. And there's precedent for that. In the book of Genesis, chapter 5, Enoch, great Old Testament figure, the seventh of the 10 patriarchs before the flood, revered as a righteous man, he was taken up alive. And there was a long tradition of a belief in that. Elijah, in the fiery chariot, at the end of his life, he was taken up into heaven, alive. So that idea of someone being taken up to heaven alive was not really foreign to the Hebrew mind. And so when it happened, it was believable, that God could have taken Mary up, body and soul, at the end of her life without going through death. So that's, again, another kind of, you might say, evidence or lack of evidence. There's no bones, so there's no evidence of her death. And we do believe we know the spot. In fact, that's kind of disputed. If you go to the Holy Land, there's a couple different places in Jerusalem where the tradition is where she actually fell asleep. The Church of the Dormition, which is the place traditionally, but there's another place, right? There's another place on the other side of town. People claim it happened over there. So there's a dispute going back and forth. But they do have this tradition of where the place was where Mary, I won't say died, but Mary ended her life on earth before she was taken up. And it's a beautiful church. And the iconography, too, is more evidence of the assumption. Not only do we not have her bones or relics, which would say, okay, why? Well, because she was taken up to heaven, but there's no body. But also the early depictions of iconography, especially in the catacombs. So those first centuries, there are frescoes on the walls of the catacombs, and there's depictions of a woman with a crown on her head in heaven. So it's obviously not on earth, seated around, and seated around her are the 12 apostles. That's one of the oldest frescoes in the catacombs in Rome. And I remember seeing that my very first visit to Rome and just struck by that. Wow. The early Christians then must have believed that she was taken up to heaven, and now she reigns as queen in heaven with the apostles, body and soul, And that was really in the imagination and the belief of the early Christians. Why would they paint that on the wall? And that dates back to the 100s, the second century, early 100s. So that was, couple generations later. And we'd be like your great-grandparents, you got this from your great-grandparents. That's how close it was to the actual event. So all of this, to me, why would we even doubt that? That it all fits together. And the last thing I'll say is a very interesting thing that I was, in my prayer today, was thinking about. Because the readings for the vigil are different from the readings tomorrow, right? And the first reading for the vigil is from Chronicles. And it's the story, the first book of Chronicles, and it's the story. I say, why is this right? It's the story of David carrying the Ark of the Covenant into Jerusalem and erecting the tent over the ark and celebrating this, what appears to be a very solemn liturgy. There was instruments and harps and lyres and chanters and song and rejoicing. So there was this huge celebration. And, of course, the temple wasn't built. Solomon, his son, was charged with that duty. David wanted to build it, but God said, no, you're not going to do it. Your son's going to do it. So they just had a tent. But that was the temple. That was the first temple. And that was the Ark of the Covenant, because that was the Holy of Holies. That's where the Ten Commandments were. That was the holiest place for the people of Israel, because that's where the revelation of Moses was given. And so fast forward to the very end of the Bible, to chapter 12 of Revelation, and that reading is going to be proclaimed tomorrow, where John is looking in heaven. He's having this vision in heaven, and he's looking at the Ark of the Covenant. He's looking at the Ark of the Covenant. And that's how that passage, God's temple in heaven was opened, and the Ark of his covenant could be seen in the temple. So here John is having this revelation in heaven. Oh, he's on earth. He's not dead. But he's having this revelation of heaven. And all of a sudden, in a flash, a woman appears in the sky. It doesn't tell you what happened to the Ark of the Covenant. It just says a great sign appeared in the sky, and a woman clothed with the sun and the moon under her feet. One of the most ancient titles of Mary was the Ark of the New Covenant. She was the Ark of the New Covenant. Her ark, her womb, housed, it's kind of a crass way to put it, but her womb was the dwelling place of the New Covenant. And so she was an ark, like in the Old Testament, carrying the Holy of Holies in her womb. And so that's why the early Christians referred to her as the Ark of the New Covenant. And so it's interesting how John is looking and having this vision of heaven, and he sees the Ark of the Covenant in the temple, and then all of a sudden a flash, and there's a woman clothed with the sun. And she was with child, who wailed aloud in pain as she gave birth. And it goes on and on. So the diadems, and the dragon was slain, and the child was born, and the woman herself, it's all this obviously Marian imagery, but it's all linked to the Ark of the Covenant. So I thought that was interesting too, that first reading about the Ark of the Covenant was chosen for the vigil. And that one of the great titles, Mary as the Ark of the New Covenant. So as we celebrate her Assumption and we honor her, we think about the fact that, she is where we hope to be one day, body and soul. She's the first fruits, you might say. I mean, Jesus is the first fruit of the resurrection, but she's the next fruit of the resurrection. She's already there, glorified in her body, where we one day, at the end of time, we will also be there with her. And we will be united with our bodies in the resurrection of the dead at the end of the world. And we will be like her, assumed gloriously into heaven. And so to me, that's kind of the beauty of this feast day, is that it gives us kind of an insight of our end goal. This is where we all hope to be someday with her in heaven, body and soul, assumed like the Blessed Mother.